Welcome to Relics of Time. Tonight, we travel back into the ancient world, to the lands of dust, fire, stone, and kings. To a civilization that rose from the rugged plateaus of Iran and grew into one of the largest, richest, and most sophisticated empires the world had ever seen. This is the story of the Persian Empire. An empire of conquerors, but also administrators. An empire of armies, but also roads, laws, diplomacy, and astonishing cultural tolerance. An empire whose kings ruled from palaces of carved stone, whose messengers crossed continents, whose officials governed lands stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley, and whose memory still echoes through history, religion, and legend. In this episode, we will explore the rise of Persia from scattered tribes to imperial power, the genius of Cyrus the Great, the expansion under his successors, the system that allowed this empire to govern millions, its religion, culture, and conflicts, its famous wars with Greece, and finally its fall beneath the unstoppable force of Alexander the Great. But to understand how Persia conquered the world, we must begin before the empire, before the palaces of Persepolis, before the armies of Darius and Xerxes, before the name, Persia, inspired awe across the ancient world. We must begin in a harsher place. A place of mountains, windswept plains, horsemen, tribal loyalties, and old rivalries. A place where empires were not born in comfort, but in struggle. If you enjoy ancient history, forgotten civilizations, and epic stories of power, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It helps support the channel and allows us to continue bringing these long-form historical journeys to life. Now, let us step into the ancient Iranian plateau, and let us witness the birth of Persia. Long before the Persian Empire emerged, the region that would give birth to it was a land of extremes. The Iranian plateau was not like the river valleys of Egypt or Mesopotamia. It did not offer the same natural abundance as the Nile or the Tigris and Euphrates. Instead, it was a landscape of highlands, dry plains, jagged mountains, deserts, and scattered fertile pockets. To survive here required resilience, and that mattered, because geography shapes people, and in the case of ancient Persia, geography helped shape one of the toughest, most adaptable ruling cultures in the ancient world. The peoples who lived in this region were not originally part of one unified state. They were made up of different Iranian-speaking tribes, many of whom had likely migrated into the area over centuries from regions farther north or northeast. Among these groups were the Medes and the Persians. At first, either of them ruled a great empire. They lived among stronger and older powers. To the west stood Mesopotamia, cradle of ancient kingdoms and cities. There had already been Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, civilizations with writing, monumental architecture, legal traditions, and imperial ambitions stretching back thousands of years. To the northwest and west, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had once dominated the Near East with unmatched brutality and military efficiency. The Assyrians had perfected terror as a political tool. They deported populations, crushed rebellions, and built one of the most feared empires of antiquity. But no empire lasts forever. By the late 7th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire began to collapse under the combined pressure of rebellion, internal instability, and foreign enemies. Among those enemies were the Babylonians and the Medes. This was crucial, because the fall of Assyria created a power vacuum, and power vacuums are where new empires are born. The Medes emerged as a major force in western Iran and began to build a kingdom strong enough to compete with Babylon and other regional powers. The Persians, meanwhile, remained smaller, centered in the region later known as Persis, or Parsa, in southwestern Iran. At this stage, the Persians were not yet masters of the Near East. They were a people on the edge of history, still overshadowed by larger states, still waiting for the leader who would change everything. But even then, the foundations were forming. The Persians were learning from older civilizations around them. They observed the administrative traditions of Mesopotamia. They inherited elements of military organization from neighboring powers. They developed a culture rooted in tribal loyalty, horsemanship, aristocratic leadership, and an emerging sense of identity. They were not yet an empire, but they were becoming the kind of people who could build one. And in time, one man would rise among them. A king whose name would survive for more than 2,500 years. A conqueror remembered not only for victory, but for restraint. A ruler feared by enemies, yet praised in the traditions of conquered peoples. That man was Cyrus. To understand why Cyrus the Great was so extraordinary, we first need to understand the world he entered. The Near East in the 6th century BC was a region of powerful kingdoms, strategic alliances, and constant tension. No single state fully controlled everything. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, centered in Mesopotamia, was one of the great powers of the age. Babylon itself was one of the most magnificent cities on earth, wealthy, ancient, and deeply symbolic. Its walls, temples, and ziggurats projected prestige and sacred legitimacy. To the west, in Anatolia, stood the kingdom of Lydia, famous for its wealth and its king, Croesus, a ruler whose riches became legendary even in antiquity. Lydia controlled valuable trade routes and had access to the Aegean world, linking the east with the Greek city-states of the western coast. To the southwest, Egypt remained one of the most prestigious civilizations in the ancient world, though its political power had risen and fallen many times. Egypt still possessed enormous cultural authority and economic strength, and in the Iranian world itself, the Medes were dominant over the Persians. This is where the story becomes especially important, because according to later traditions, the Persians were initially under Median authority. Whether that relationship was one of direct control, loose overlordship, or alliance is still debated by historians, but the key point remains the same. Before Cyrus, the Persians were not the masters, they were the lesser partner. And then everything changed. The ancient sources surrounding Cyrus contain a mixture of history, royal propaganda, and legend. Like many great founders, his life became mythologized. Stories about his birth, his survival, and his destiny circulated widely. Some accounts describe omens and prophecies. Some describe attempts to kill him as an infant, only for fate to preserve him. Whether or not these stories are literally true, their existence tells us something important. Even in antiquity, people understood that Cyrus was no ordinary king. He was remembered as a world-changing figure. The kind of ruler who appears only rarely in history. The kind who doesn't just inherit a kingdom, but transforms the entire map. Cyrus II, later known as Cyrus the Great, emerged in the mid-6th century BC as the ruler of the Persians. At first glance, his rise might have seemed improbable. He was not the king of Babylon. He was not the ruler of Egypt. He was not the heir to an ancient imperial capital with centuries of prestige behind him. He ruled a people who, in the eyes of many, stood below the Medes. And yet within a few decades, Cyrus would overthrow the regional order of the Near East. His first great achievement was the defeat of the Median king Astyages. This was more than a military victory. It was a revolution in power. By defeating the Medes, Cyrus did not simply destroy them, he absorbed them. This is one of the earliest signs of what made Persian imperial rule so effective. Instead of annihilating defeated elites whenever possible, Cyrus often incorporated them. He understood something many conquerors did not. An empire can be built faster through integration than through endless destruction. The Medes did not vanish after their defeat. They became part of the new imperial structure. Median nobles, traditions, and military strength were woven into the emerging Persian state. This gave Cyrus immediate advantages: experienced administrators, access to larger manpower pools, and a broader political base. This was the first major step. But it was only the beginning. Because once Cyrus unified Persians and Medes, he was no longer the ruler of a tribal kingdom. He was now the head of a rising power, one that could challenge the great kingdoms of the Near East. And challenge them he did. After consolidating his position in the Iranian world, Cyrus turned westward. There, one of the most powerful rulers in the region watched him carefully, Croesus of Lydia. Croesus was no minor king. He was immensely wealthy, strategically positioned, and connected to the Greek world of western Anatolia. Lydia controlled important cities and trade networks. Its influence extended into territories where Greek culture and Eastern power intersected. Ancient tradition often portrays Croesus as a symbol of wealth, and of the danger of overconfidence. According to classical accounts, Croesus consulted the oracle of Delphi before going to war with Cyrus. The oracle reportedly told him that if he crossed the river and attacked, he would destroy a great empire. He did. But the empire he destroyed was his own. The war between Cyrus and Croesus ended with the Persian capture of Sardis, the Lydian capital. This was a turning point of enormous significance. With Lydia defeated, Cyrus gained control over one of the richest kingdoms in the Near East, access to Anatolia and the Aegean frontier, influence over the Greek cities of the western coast, major trade routes linking inland Asia with the Mediterranean world. This conquest also brought Persia into long-term contact, and eventually conflict, with the Greeks. But that future was still ahead. For now, what mattered was this. Cyrus was no longer just a regional king. He had defeated the Medes. He had defeated Lydia. He had absorbed powerful elites into his system. And he was steadily assembling a political structure far larger than anything the Persians had ever known. Yet the greatest prize of all still remained, and it was the most famous city in the ancient world: Babylon. Cyrus' reputation as a tolerant ruler is one of the most enduring parts of his legacy. He has often been remembered as a king who allowed conquered peoples to retain their religions, customs, and local identities. This included the famous tradition, preserved in biblical texts, that he allowed the Jews exiled in Babylon to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This act became deeply significant in Jewish memory. In later biblical tradition, Cyrus is portrayed not merely as a foreign king, but as an instrument of divine purpose. That is extraordinary. Very few non-Israelite rulers are remembered in such a positive way in biblical literature. Now, from a historical perspective, we should be careful. Persian tolerance was not modern liberalism. This was still an empire. It still demanded tribute, loyalty, and submission. It still used force when necessary. But compared to many ancient conquerors, the Persian model was distinct. Instead of trying to erase local identities, the Persians often worked through them. This had practical advantages. Local priests could support imperial rule if temples were respected. Local elites could cooperate if their status was preserved. Subject populations were less likely to revolt if their traditions were not attacked directly. Administration became easier when local systems were adapted rather than destroyed. This was not weakness. It was political intelligence. Cyrus grasped a truth that many conquerors learned too late. If you want to rule vast territories for generations, you cannot govern everyone the same way. You must build a structure flexible enough to hold difference together. This principle would become one of the defining strengths of the Persian Empire, and it helps explain why Cyrus' legacy became so immense. He was not remembered only as a conqueror. He was remembered as a founder. A ruler who did not simply win battles, but created a new model of empire. By the end of Cyrus' major conquests, the map of the Near East had been transformed. The Persians now ruled the former Median territories, Lydia and much of Anatolia, Babylon and Mesopotamia, vast populations of different languages, faiths, and traditions. This was no longer a kingdom. This was an empire. But more importantly, it was becoming a new kind of empire. The Persians inherited from older civilizations, Assyria, Babylon, Elam, and others, but they did not simply copy them, they adapted. From Assyria, they could observe the power of centralized rule and imperial logistics. From Babylon, they inherited contact with one of the richest administrative and intellectual traditions in the ancient world. From the Medes and Iranian tribal culture, they retained aristocratic values, mobility, and military cohesion. From Lydia and Anatolia, they gained access to new frontiers and Western trade. What emerged was a hybrid imperial system, strong enough to conquer, flexible enough to absorb, and intelligent enough to endure. This is why the Persian Empire matters so much in world history. Because it was not just large. It was organized. It was not just feared. It was functional. And in the ancient world, that made all the difference. Empires can rise quickly through violence, but only a few can hold together enormous territories across different climates, cultures, and continents. Persia was one of those few. And the foundations of that achievement were laid by Cyrus. But his story was not yet over. Because, like many empire builders, he did not die peacefully in a palace surrounded by luxury. He died as he had lived in the shadow of war. The final years of Cyrus remain partly uncertain, wrapped in both historical evidence and later legend. What seems likely is that he died during a campaign in the east, perhaps against nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples beyond the core imperial zones, possibly the Massagetæ, though the details are debated. The eastern frontiers of empire were dangerous. Unlike wealthy urban kingdoms such as Babylon or Lydia, these regions did not always offer clear capitals to capture or administrative systems to absorb. They were mobile, unpredictable, and difficult to control, and that reminds us of something important. Even the greatest empire of its age still had limits. The farther an empire expands, the more complex its challenges become. If Cyrus did indeed die in battle or on campaign, then his end was fitting in a tragic, almost mythic sense. The founder of the empire, the man who united Persians and Medes, defeated Lydia, captured Babylon, and reshaped the political world of the Near East, met his end. Not in comfort, but in motion, still reaching outward, still confronting the unknown. His body was later associated with a tomb at Pasargadae, the early royal center of the Persian kings. That tomb, simple compared to the grandeur of later imperial monuments, still stands as one of the most haunting symbols of ancient power, because within it lies the memory of a man whose influence far exceeded the size of his grave. Cyrus was gone, but the empire he created was not. In many ways, it was only beginning. History is full of conquerors. Some are remembered because they destroyed, some because they terrified, some because they ruled briefly and vanished. Cyrus is remembered for something rarer. He built. He conquered, yes. But he also created the political framework for one of the most successful imperial systems of antiquity. He changed how power could work across distance. He showed that a ruler could dominate many peoples without trying to erase every local tradition. He demonstrated that imperial stability could come not only from fear, but from accommodation, administration, and symbolic legitimacy. This does not make him a saint. Ancient empire was still empire. There was still war, tribute, hierarchy, and coercion. But by the standards of his age, Cyrus stands apart, and that is why his name echoes across different traditions. In Persian memory, he became the great founder in Greek accounts. Even hostile observers often treated him with unusual respect in biblical tradition. He appears as a liberating ruler in modern history. He is often invoked as a symbol of wise kingship and early imperial statecraft. Few ancient rulers are admired by so many different civilizations. That alone tells us how extraordinary he was. But no founder controls what comes after. The empire now had to survive succession. And that is where even great dynasties can fracture. Would Cyrus' heirs preserve what he built? Or would the empire break apart after the death of its creator? That is where the next chapter begins. Cyrus the Great had transformed the Persians from a rising regional power into the masters of a vast empire. He defeated the Medes. He broke Lydia. He entered Babylon. He reshaped the politics of the ancient Near East. And he created an imperial vision strong enough to outlive him. But the death of a founder is always dangerous. Because building an empire is one thing, holding it together is another. In the next part, we will continue with the reign of Cambyses II, the conquest of Egypt, the crisis of succession, and the rise of one of the greatest imperial organizers in history, Darius the Great. And with him, Persia will become not just an empire of conquest, but an empire of systems, roads, laws, tribute, and royal power on a scale the ancient world had never seen. When Cyrus the Great died, he left behind something rare in the ancient world, not merely a conquered territory, but the beginnings of a true imperial system. Yet the death of a founder always creates danger, because in the ancient world, the strength of a state was often tied to the strength of a single man. When that man was gone, rivals emerged, ambitions sharpened, loyalties shifted, and the question became unavoidable: could the empire survive its creator? For Persia, the answer would not come easily. The empire passed to Cyrus' son, Cambyses II. He would expand Persian power even further, carrying its armies into one of the oldest and most prestigious civilizations on earth, Egypt. But his reign would also be shadowed by blood, suspicion, and instability. And after him, the Persian Empire would plunge into one of the most dangerous moments in its early history, a succession crisis so serious that the empire itself might have shattered before it ever reached its true height. Out of that crisis would emerge a new ruler. A man who was not the founder, but who would become the great organizer. A king who would transform Persia from a powerful conquest state into one of the most sophisticated empires of antiquity. That man was Darius I. But before Darius, there was war, uncertainty, and the conquest of Egypt. When Cambyses II inherited the throne after the death of Cyrus, he stepped into one of the most difficult roles in history. To succeed a great founder is often harder than to become one. Because the founder is allowed to create, the heir is expected to preserve, expand, and prove worthy of the legacy. Cambyses inherited a vast empire that stretched across multiple regions, languages, and political traditions. He ruled over lands that had once belonged to the Medes, the Lydians, and the Babylonians. He governed peoples who did not necessarily identify as Persian. He held together an imperial structure still young enough to be fragile. The sources for Cambyses are complicated. Much of what later generations believed about him came through Greek authors, especially Herodotus, whose accounts mix valuable information with rumor, moral storytelling, and dramatic embellishment. In many of these narratives, Cambyses appears unstable, harsh, suspicious, and at times even impious. But historians must be cautious. Rulers who experienced internal turmoil are often remembered through the lens of propaganda, especially when later rulers need to justify why they replaced them. What we can say with confidence is this: Cambyses continued the expansionist momentum of his father, and his greatest campaign would be one of the most significant achievements of early Persian imperial history. He would conquer Egypt. To understand why the conquest of Egypt was so important, we need to understand what Egypt represented in the 6th century BC. Egypt was not just another kingdom. It was one of the oldest and most prestigious civilizations in human history. Long before Persia became an empire, Egypt had already built pyramids, temples, monumental tombs, and a religious system that had shaped its society for millennia. Its kings claimed divine authority. Its scribes maintained one of the world's oldest traditions of literacy and administration. Its agricultural wealth, sustained by the annual flooding of the Nile, made it economically powerful and strategically vital. To conquer Egypt was to claim more than land. It was to claim prestige. It was to take one of the great crowns of the ancient world and place it beneath Persian rule. There were also strategic reasons. Egypt could support anti-Persian resistance in the Levant. It could influence trade across the eastern Mediterranean. Its wealth, manpower, and grain resources made it a prize of enormous value. As long as Egypt remained independent, Persia's western and southwestern frontier remained incomplete. For Cambyses, the conquest of Egypt was not optional if Persia was to dominate the Near East. It was necessary. And so he marched. Around 525 BC, Cambyses launched a Persian invasion of Egypt. The Egyptian ruler at the time was Psamtik III, a pharaoh of the late period who inherited a kingdom already under pressure. Egypt had powerful traditions and deep symbolic legitimacy, but it was no longer the unstoppable force it had once been in earlier ages. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Pelusium, near the eastern approaches to the Nile Delta. Ancient stories later surrounded this battle with strange and dramatic details. Some accounts claimed the Persians used animals, especially cats, sacred to the Egyptian goddess Batet, as a psychological tactic against Egyptian troops. These stories are vivid and memorable, but historians debate how much of this is legend. What matters is the result. The Persians won. With Pelusium broken, the road into Egypt opened. Memphis, one of the great urban and political centers of Egypt, fell soon after. For the first time, Egypt, land of the pharaohs, temples, and the Nile, became part of the Persian imperial world. This was an astonishing moment. Think of what it meant historically. A civilization with thousands of years of royal tradition, one that had long viewed itself as a sacred cosmic kingdom, was now ruled by a foreign empire from the Iranian plateau. And yet, once again, the Persians showed one of their defining traits. They did not simply loot and leave. They governed. Cambyses took on the role of pharaoh in Egyptian tradition. Persian rule in Egypt adapted itself to local forms of legitimacy. Temples continued to matter. Priests remained important. Administration continued, though now within the framework of a larger empire. This pattern is critical to understanding Persia. Again and again, Persian kings conquered ancient civilizations, and then stepped into their political symbolism rather than trying to erase it entirely. This was not always smooth. It did not eliminate resistance, but it was often effective. Egypt was now Persian, and with that, the empire of Cyrus had grown even larger. Yet despite this extraordinary victory, Cambyses' reputation in ancient history became deeply troubled. Greek sources, especially Herodotus, describe him as increasingly unstable after the conquest of Egypt. They tell stories of cruel punishments, impulsive violence, disrespect toward Egyptian religious customs, suspicion and paranoia toward members of his own family, the alleged murder of his brother Bardia. Also known as Smyrdes in Greek tradition, some of these stories may preserve real tensions. Others may be distorted, exaggerated, or politically motivated. Why? Because history is often written by survivors, and in the case of Cambyses, the man who came after him, Darius, had every reason to frame the succession in a way that justified his own rise. Still, even if we strip away the most dramatic stories, one thing is clear. Cambyses' reign ended in instability. He was not remembered as a second Cyrus. He was remembered as a king surrounded by uncertainty, fear, and unresolved succession. That matters, because the Persian Empire was still young. If the royal line fractured now, the empire might collapse before its institutions fully matured. And then came the crisis point. One of the most fascinating and controversial episodes in early Persian history concerns the figure known as Bardia. According to the version later promoted by Darius, Cambyses had secretly killed his own brother Bardia before leaving for Egypt. While Cambyses was away, a man named Gaumata, described as a magus or priestly figure, supposedly impersonated Bardia and seized the throne. This false Bardia, according to Darius' later inscription, then ruled briefly while many in the empire believed the true royal heir had returned. It is a dramatic story. Too dramatic, some historians suspect. Because there is another possibility. What if the man who ruled after Cambyses was not an impostor, but the real Bardia? If so, then Darius' official narrative would not be the restoration of legitimate rule. It would be a coup. We may never know with certainty, and that uncertainty is one of the most intriguing parts of Persian history. What we do know is this: after Cambyses died, under circumstances that themselves remain debated, the empire entered a moment of severe political instability. The throne was contested, loyalties were divided, regional elites had to choose sides, and the survival of the empire itself was suddenly in question. This is the kind of moment when great states can disintegrate. Because when the center weakens, provinces rebel, ambitious nobles move, old enemies test the borders, and what looked like a solid empire can dissolve into fragments. That Persia did not collapse here is one of the clearest signs that its foundations, though still fragile, were stronger than they might appear. But survival would require decisive action. And that action came from a man not originally next in line. A man who would seize power, and then spend years proving he deserved it. That Darius I, later known as Darius the Great, did not inherit the empire in the same way Cyrus or Cambyses had. He took it in a moment of crisis. According to his own famous inscription at Behistun, Darius and a group of loyal nobles killed the false Bardia and restored legitimate rule. The inscription presents Darius as the chosen defender of truth against Ali. It is one of the most important royal inscriptions in ancient history, and one of the most politically revealing, because the very fact that Darius needed such a monumental public justification tells us something essential. His legitimacy was not automatic. He had to explain himself. He had to persuade the empire. He had to convince elites, provinces, soldiers, and subjects that he was not a usurper, but the rightful king. And in the ancient world, legitimacy was not just about blood. It was about survival. If Darius could hold the throne, defeat rivals, and restore order, then his claim became stronger with every victory, and he would need many victories, because once he took power, rebellions erupted across the empire. The early reign of Darius was anything but secure. In fact, it was one of the most dangerous periods the Persian Empire ever faced. Across the empire, revolts broke out, in Babylonia and Media and Elam and Persis itself and other regions where local leaders claimed legitimacy, royal blood, or divine backing. Why did this happen? Because whenever central authority weakens, old identities return. Babylonians could imagine a Babylonian restoration. Medes could imagine recovering their former dominance. Regional nobles could imagine carving out their own kingdoms. Darius had to stop all of them, and he did. The Behistun inscription, carved high into a cliff face, is both a declaration of triumph and a warning. It depicts Darius with defeated rebels bound before him, while the god Ahura Mazda legitimizes his kingship from above. The message is unmistakable. The king has restored order. The rebels lied. Truth has defeated falsehood. This was not only military propaganda. It was ideological warfare. Darius was shaping how the empire would understand itself, not as a collection of territories temporarily held together by conquest, but as a divinely sanctioned imperial order in which rebellion was not merely treason, it was chaos itself. This is one of the most important turning points in Persian history, because after Darius crushed the revolts, he did more than save the empire. He stabilized it, and then he transformed it. If Cyrus was the founder, then Darius was the architect. Cyrus created the empire through conquest and political vision. Darius turned it into a functioning machine. This is why Darius is one of the greatest rulers of the ancient world. He understood a simple truth. A huge empire cannot survive on charisma forever. It needs systems. It needs records. It needs roads. It needs taxation. It needs governors. It needs oversight. It needs communication fast enough to prevent local power from becoming independent. Power. Darius reorganized the empire into a more formal structure of satrapies, administrative provinces governed by officials known as satraps. Some version of provincial governance already existed before him, but under Darius it became more systematized and more clearly integrated into imperial administration. Each satrapy had responsibilities: collect tribute and taxes, maintain local order, provide troops when needed, oversee infrastructure and logistics, represent royal authority in the region. But Darius was too intelligent to trust governors completely. He knew the danger. A satrap with too much power could become a king in all but name. So the empire created checks. Military authority, civil authority, and financial oversight were often divided. Royal inspectors, sometimes remembered in tradition as the king's eyes and ears, moved through the empire to monitor loyalty and detect corruption. This was sophisticated statecraft, not modern, of course, but for the ancient world it was extraordinary. Darius was building not just an empire, but an imperial administrative logic. Among Darius' most famous achievements was the expansion and refinement of the imperial road system, especially the route later known as the Royal Road. This was more than a road. It was an artery of empire, stretching across great distances, from the Persian heartlands through Mesopotamia and into Anatolia. It allowed communication, administration, military movement, and economic integration on a scale that stunned ancient observers. Stations along the route supported royal messengers. Fresh horses could be provided. Travel could be organized in stages. Orders from the king could move faster than any rival power expected. This is where Persian imperial brilliance becomes truly visible. Because conquest is visible, battles are dramatic, kings and palaces attract attention. But what really holds an empire together? Roads, messages, schedules, supplies, accountability. An empire lives or dies by logistics. And Darius understood logistics. This is why later traditions admired Persian communication systems so deeply. The famous idea that neither snow, nor rain, nor darkness stops the king's couriers, though often romanticized later, reflects a genuine ancient admiration for Persian efficiency. With roads came trade. With trade came wealth. With wealth came stability, at least for a time. The empire was no longer just a political structure imposed by force. It was becoming an interconnected world. No empire survives without resources, and Darius knew that symbolic legitimacy and military force had to be matched by fiscal order. He regularized tribute and taxation across the empire. Different regions contributed in different forms, depending on their wealth, geography, and economic specialization. Some regions provided silver, others grain, others horses, livestock, luxury goods, timber, textiles, or specialized materials. This mattered for two reasons. First, it gave the empire predictability. Second, it made imperial power measurable. A satrapy was not just a territory on a map. It was part of a revenue system. This transformed empire into something more structured and durable. Darius also introduced and standardized coinage in ways that strengthened imperial exchange, especially through the famous daric, a high-value gold coin associated with Persian royal authority. Coinage did not replace all local forms of economic life, far from it, but it reinforced the image of a centralized imperial economy and facilitated broader networks of exchange. This is what made Persia so formidable. It was not merely rich because it conquered. It remained rich because it organized. And that distinction is everything. Darius did not present himself merely as a military victor. He presented himself as a universal ruler. His inscriptions repeatedly emphasize divine favor from Ahura Mazda, the importance of truth, the suppression of the lie, justice, order, and rightful kingship. This was not abstract theology. It was political ideology. Darius needed the empire to believe that he was not simply stronger than his rivals, but more legitimate than them, and so his kingship was framed as cosmic. The king was not just the ruler of Persia. He was the guardian of order across a diverse and unstable world. This is one reason Persian imperial art becomes so powerful in this period. Royal imagery was carefully controlled. In reliefs and inscriptions, the king appears calm, elevated, larger than others, and perfectly ordered. The empire is shown not as chaos, but as hierarchy harmonized under royal power. This was deliberate. It sent a message across the empire: many peoples, many languages, many lands point one king, and under Darius, that message became real. The Persian Empire had survived its first great crisis. Cambyses had conquered Egypt, bringing one of the oldest civilizations in the world under Persian rule. But his reign ended in instability, suspicion, and a dangerous succession struggle. Out of that chaos rose Darius, and with him, Persia changed forever. And no longer merely the empire of Cyrus' victories. It became the empire of roads, tribute, administration, inspectors, satrapies, royal ideology, and imperial structure on a scale the ancient world had rarely seen. Darius did not simply hold the empire together. He made it stronger. He made it smarter. He made it harder to break. But power always invites ambition, and the more successful Persia became, the more it would collide with other worlds. In the next part, we will enter the age of Persepolis, imperial grandeur, Zoroastrian kingship, and the growing tension with the Greek world. We will explore how Persia reached the height of its magnificence, and how the seeds of one of history's most famous conflicts were already being planted, and the empire is still rising. By the reign of Darius the Great, the Persian Empire was no longer simply a rising power. It had become the largest and most sophisticated empire the world had yet seen. From the mountains of Iran to the valleys of Mesopotamia, from the ruins of ancient Assyria to the temples of Egypt, from Central Asia to the western shores of Anatolia, the empire of Persia stretched across climates, languages, religions, and civilizations that had once believed themselves too ancient, too proud, or too powerful to be ruled by outsiders, and yet they were now all part of a single imperial system. But great empires do not survive by force alone. They must create symbols. They must make power visible. They must transform domination into legitimacy. They must convince not only the conquered, but also themselves, that their rule is part of a greater order. This is the world in which Persepolis was born. A ceremonial capital unlike anything the empire had built before. A city not meant merely to function, but to impress. A city of terraces, columns, stairways, carved delegations, and royal imagery. A city where empire became theater. And yet, beneath this magnificence, something else was growing. because as Persia expanded westward, it encountered a different kind of world. Not a single kingdom, not a unified civilization, but a patchwork of fiercely independent Greek city-states, divided among themselves. Yet proud, competitive, and deeply resistant to foreign rule. At first, this tension was political, then strategic, then ideological, and eventually, it would become war. But before the clash with Greece, we must understand Persia at its height. Because to understand why the Greek-Persian wars mattered, we first need to understand what exactly Greece was facing. Not a barbarian horde, not an accidental empire, but one of the most advanced imperial civilizations of the ancient world. By the late 6th and early 5th century BC, under Darius I, Persia had become an imperial superpower. Its territory was immense. Its resources were staggering. Its rulers controlled Mesopotamia, including Babylonia, the former Median lands, much of Anatolia, including the former Lydian realm, the Levant, Egypt, parts of Central Asia, regions extending toward the Indus Valley, the Persian heartland itself. This scale is difficult to fully imagine. Ancient empires before Persia had been powerful, but many were regionally concentrated. Assyria was terrifying, but its model was intensely militarized and often unstable. Babylon was culturally prestigious, but geographically more limited. Egypt was ancient and wealthy, but focused on the Nile world and its surrounding spheres. Persia was different. Persia created a transcontinental imperial framework. It ruled multiple ancient civilizations simultaneously. And remarkably, it did so not by flattening all local identity, but by layering imperial authority over pre-existing cultures. This is why the Persian Empire can feel strangely modern in certain ways. It was not one people conquering everyone and forcing uniformity. It was a hierarchy of diversity. The Persians did not need everyone to become Persian. They needed everyone to remain governable. That distinction made the empire powerful. But it also made it complex. And complexity requires ritual, symbolism, and a political center that can hold many worlds together. This is where Persepolis enters history. When people think of ancient Persia, they often imagine one place above all others, Persepolis. But Persepolis was not the empire's only capital. The Persian Empire operated through multiple royal centers, including Susa, Ecbatana, Babylon, and others. This made practical sense for a vast empire that stretched across climates and regions. So why build Persepolis? Because Persepolis was not just administrative. It was ceremonial. It was symbolic. It was a monumental statement about kingship. Construction began under Darius I, and the site was later expanded by Xerxes I and subsequent rulers. Built on a great stone terrace in the Persian heartland, Persepolis rose not as a city of crowded streets and commercial chaos, but as an orchestrated stage of imperial architecture. Its great halls, staircases, gateways, and reliefs were designed to communicate a message. Every stone said, "This is the center of the world." Not necessarily in the geographic sense, but in the political and cosmic sense. This is where the king stands above the nations. The Apadana, the great audience hall, is especially important. Its monumental stairways are decorated with some of the most famous reliefs in ancient art, delegations from across the empire bringing tribute to the king. This imagery matters. These are not scenes of frantic battle, not piles of corpses, not the brutal violence often associated with Assyrian art. Instead, the delegations are ordered, dignified, and distinct. Each group wears different clothing, carries different gifts, represents a different region. They are not erased. They are displayed. That is the genius of Persian imperial imagery. It does not deny diversity. It frames diversity as submission within harmony. The empire becomes a procession of nations, and the king becomes the still point around which all peoples move. Persian royal art is fascinating because of what it chooses not to emphasize. If you compare Persian reliefs with earlier Assyrian palace art, the contrast is striking. Assyrian kings often celebrated siege warfare, slaughter, captives, executions, violent domination. The raw terror of conquest. Persian art, especially at Persepolis, tends to present something different. The king is calm. The figures are arranged. The processions are measured. The imagery is repetitive in a deliberate way. This is not because Persia was peaceful. Persia fought wars, crushed revolts, and maintained power through force when necessary. But the image it projected was not, "We destroy the world." It was, "We organize the world." This is a far more sophisticated imperial message. Violence can conquer, but order legitimizes. The reliefs at Persepolis create an almost timeless image of stability. They show a world where the empire's many peoples come willingly, or at least properly, into the royal presence. This was political theater carved in stone, and for subjects from across the empire. The symbolism would have been powerful. Imagine arriving from Egypt, Lydia, Bactria, Babylon, or Elam, climbing monumental stairways, passing through guarded gates, entering halls supported by forests of columns, and seeing yourself represented among the nations of the empire. You are not merely conquered, you are incorporated, but always beneath the king. To understand Persian kingship, we also need to discuss religion. This is where things become more complex. Modern people often ask, was the Persian Empire officially Zoroastrian? The answer is not as simple as yes or no. The religion associated with Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, would later become one of the great religious traditions of the Iranian world. Its concepts of truth, falsehood, cosmic struggle, moral choice, and divine order deeply shaped Persian royal ideology. But the exact relationship between the early Achaemenid kings and fully developed later Zoroastrianism is debated by historians. What we can say confidently is this: the royal inscriptions of Darius and Xerxes place enormous emphasis on Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda is presented as the great god who granted kingship, supported the king, and upheld truth and order. This matters because Persian kingship was not merely political. It was moralized. The king was not only the strongest ruler. He was the protector of truth against the lie. This language appears repeatedly in royal inscriptions. That phrase, truth versus lie, is incredibly important. It turns rebellion into something bigger than politics. A rebel is not just a rival. A rebel becomes an agent of falsehood. This is brilliant statecraft. Because once political opposition is framed as cosmic disorder, the king is no longer just suppressing dissent. He is restoring the moral structure of the world. Whether we call this fully Zoroastrian, in a later doctrinal sense, is debated. But there is no doubt that Persian kingship drew on an Iranian religious worldview in which order, truth, divine favor, and righteous rule were deeply connected, and that gave the empire something many conquest states never achieve: a moral narrative. The Persian Empire is often praised for tolerance, and compared to many ancient empires, that reputation has some truth. The Persians generally allowed local religions to continue. They worked with existing elites. They preserved local administrative traditions. They often respected temples, priesthoods, and regional customs when those institutions supported stability. This is one reason Cyrus gained such a strong later reputation, especially in Babylonian and Jewish memory. But we should be careful not to romanticize. Persian tolerance was not modern liberal tolerance. It was imperial pragmatism. The empire allowed diversity because diversity was useful. A priesthood that supported order was valuable. A local governor who paid tribute was valuable. A city that remained loyal was valuable. But if a province revolted, Persia could be ruthless. Rebellions in Babylon, Egypt, and elsewhere were not treated gently. Royal inscriptions make clear that the empire was perfectly willing to use force when cooperation failed. So the Persian model was not, everyone is free, no matter what. It was, you may remain yourselves, so long as you remain within the king's order. That formula worked astonishingly well. It allowed the empire to avoid the constant cultural erasure that can create endless resistance. And it helped explain why so many regions remained part of the Persian system for generations. As Persia expanded westward, it inherited something uniquely troublesome: not a single enemy kingdom, but the fractured political world of the Greeks. In western Anatolia, along the coast of Asia Minor, there existed a number of Greek-speaking cities, especially in the region known as Ionia. These included important urban centers such as Miletus, Ephesus, Phocaea, and others along the Aegean coast. These cities had long histories of trade, colonization, competition, and political experimentation. They were not united in any stable national sense. A Greek city-state, what the Greeks called a polis, was fiercely local. Its loyalty was to itself, not to Greece, as a modern nation. That did not yet exist. Athens was Athens. Sparta was Sparta. Miletus was Miletus. They could ally, betray, trade, war, and compete in endless combinations. This made the Greek world difficult to dominate. A king could defeat one city and still face resistance from another. A ruler could install local tyrants friendly to Persia. But that did not guarantee long-term loyalty. When Persia absorbed western Anatolia, it inherited not just territory, but a politically restless frontier, and this frontier would become one of the empire's greatest headaches. The Ionian Greek cities did not immediately become the heroic freedom symbols later celebrated in Greek literature. In reality, their relationship with Persia was complex. Persian rule in Ionia often worked through local intermediaries, frequently tyrants, in the Greek sense of soul. Rulers, who were useful to Persian administration. To the Persians, this was practical. To many local Greeks, it could feel humiliating or unstable. Trade continued. Cities still functioned. Local culture survived. But the deeper issue was political autonomy. Greek polis prized self-government. Even when they were internally divided or oligarchic or tyrannical in their own ways. To be under a great king's imperial system, even a relatively flexible one, created tension. And this tension was made worse by another factor. The Greeks of the Aegean world had maritime habits, trading networks, and political identities that did not fit comfortably inside a land empire's expectations. Persia could govern them, but fully integrating them was harder. Still, for a time, Persian royal art is fascinating because of what it chooses not to emphasize. If you compare Persian reliefs with earlier Assyrian palace art, the contrast is striking. Assyrian kings often celebrated siege warfare, slaughter, captives, executions, violent domination. The raw terror of conquest. Persian art, especially at Persepolis, tends to present something different. The king is calm. The figures are arranged. The processions are measured. The imagery is repetitive in a deliberate way. This is not because Persia was peaceful. Persia fought wars, crushed revolts, and maintained power through force when necessary. But the image it projected was not, "We destroy the world." It was, "We organize the world." This is a far more sophisticated imperial message. Violence can conquer, but order legitimizes. The reliefs at Persepolis create an almost timeless image of stability. They show a world where the empire's many peoples come willingly, or at least properly, into the royal presence. This was political theater carved in stone, and for subjects from across the empire. The symbolism would have been powerful. Imagine arriving from Egypt, Lydia, Bactria, Babylon, or Elam, climbing monumental stairways, passing through guarded gates, entering halls supported by forests of columns, and seeing yourself represented among the nations of the empire. You are not merely conquered, you are incorporated, but always beneath the king. To understand Persian kingship, we also need to discuss religion. This is where things become more complex. Modern people often ask, was the Persian Empire officially Zoroastrian? The answer is not as simple as yes or no. The religion associated with Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, would later become one of the great religious traditions of the Iranian world. Its concepts of truth, falsehood, cosmic struggle, moral choice, and divine order deeply shaped Persian royal ideology. But the exact relationship between the early Achaemenid kings and fully developed later Zoroastrianism is debated by historians. What we can say confidently is this: the royal inscriptions of Darius and Xerxes place enormous emphasis on Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda is presented as the great god who granted kingship, supported the king, and upheld truth and order. This matters because Persian kingship was not merely political. It was moralized. The king was not only the strongest ruler. He was the protector of truth against the lie. This language appears repeatedly in royal inscriptions. That phrase, truth versus lie, is incredibly important. It turns rebellion into something bigger than politics. A rebel is not just a rival. A rebel becomes an agent of falsehood. This is brilliant statecraft. Because once political opposition is framed as cosmic disorder, The king is no longer just suppressing dissent, he is restoring the moral structure of the world. Whether we call this fully Zoroastrian, in a later doctrinal sense, is debated. But there is no doubt that Persian kingship drew on an Iranian religious worldview in which order, truth, divine favor, and righteous rule were deeply connected, and that gave the empire something many conquest states never achieve: a moral narrative. The Persian Empire is often praised for tolerance, and compared to many ancient empires, that reputation has some truth. The Persians generally allowed local religions to continue. They worked with existing elites. They preserved local administrative traditions. They often respected temples, priesthoods, and regional customs when those institutions supported stability. This is one reason Cyrus gained such a strong later reputation, especially in Babylonian and Jewish memory. But we should be careful not to romanticize. Persian tolerance was not modern liberal tolerance. It was imperial pragmatism. The empire allowed diversity because diversity was useful. A priesthood that supported order was valuable. A local governor who paid tribute was valuable. A city that remained loyal was valuable. But if a province revolted, Persia could be ruthless. Rebellions in Babylon, Egypt, and elsewhere were not treated gently. Royal inscriptions make clear that the empire was perfectly willing to use force when cooperation failed. So the Persian model was not everyone is free, no matter what. It was, you may remain yourselves, so long as you remain within the king's order. That formula worked astonishingly well. It allowed the empire to avoid the constant cultural erasure that can create endless resistance. And it helped explain why so many regions remained part of the Persian system for generations. As Persia expanded westward, it inherited something uniquely troublesome: not a single enemy kingdom, but the fractured political world of the Greeks. In western Anatolia, along the coast of Asia Minor, there existed a number of Greek-speaking cities, especially in the region known as Ionia. These included important urban centers such as Miletus, Ephesus, Phocaea, and others along the Aegean coast. These cities had long histories of trade, colonization, competition, and political experimentation. They were not united in any stable national sense. A Greek city-state, what the Greeks called a polis, was fiercely local. Its loyalty was to itself, not to Greece, as a modern nation. That did not yet exist. Athens was Athens. Sparta was Sparta. Miletus was Miletus. They could ally, betray, trade, war, and compete in endless combinations. This made the Greek world difficult to dominate. A king could defeat one city and still face resistance from another. A ruler could install local tyrants friendly to Persia. But that did not guarantee long-term loyalty. When Persia absorbed western Anatolia, it inherited not just territory, but a politically restless frontier. And this frontier would become one of the empire's greatest headaches. The Ionian Greek cities did not immediately become the heroic freedom symbols later celebrated in Greek literature. In reality, their relationship with Persia was complex. Persian rule in Ionia often worked through local intermediaries, frequently tyrants, in the Greek sense of soul. Rulers, who were useful to Persian administration. To the Persians, this was practical. To many local Greeks, it could feel humiliating or unstable. Trade continued. Cities still functioned. Local culture survived. But the deeper issue was political autonomy. Greek polis prized self-government. Even when they were internally divided or oligarchic or tyrannical in their own ways. To be under a great king's imperial system, even a relatively flexible one, created tension. And this tension was made worse by another factor. The Greeks of the Aegean world had maritime habits, trading networks, and political identities that did not fit comfortably inside a land empire's expectations. Persia could govern them, but fully integrating them was harder. Still, for a time, the arrangement held, until it didn't. After Darius, the throne passed to his son, Xerxes. Often remembered in legend as proud, dramatic, or excessive, Xerxes inherited not a weak kingdom, but one of the most powerful empires on earth. And he intended to finish what his father had begun. In 480 BC, Xerxes launched one of the greatest military expeditions of the ancient world. His forces crossed into Europe through the Hellespont, supported by engineering, logistics, supply systems, and imperial coordination on a staggering scale. This was not a reckless charge. It was an imperial operation. Persia came with land forces, fleets, supply routes, and planning that reflected the full strength of the Achaemenid state. For many Greeks, this must have felt like the world itself was moving toward them. One of the most famous moments in all ancient history came at Thermopylae. A small Greek force, led by King Leonidas of Sparta, attempted to block the Persian advance at a narrow pass. The story became legendary. A heroic stand, a hopeless defense, a symbol of courage against overwhelming odds. And yes, Thermopylae was real, and it mattered. But we should also remember, Persia won the battle. The pass was eventually outflanked. Leonidas and his men were killed. The road into central Greece was opened. From the Persian point of view, Thermopylae was a successful breakthrough. This is one of the key differences between history and myth. The Greeks remembered Thermopylae as moral victory. The Persians experienced it as tactical success. And after that success, Xerxes pushed deeper into Greece. With the Greek defensive line broken, Persian forces advanced. Athens was evacuated by many of its inhabitants. The city was then captured and burned. For Persia, this was direct punishment. Athens had helped the Ionian revolt. Athens had resisted Persian authority. Now Athens paid the price. This is a crucial moment, because it reminds us that the Persian campaign was not some fantasy failure from the start. Persia had already broken through Thermopylae, advanced into Greece, captured Athens, burned one of the most important Greek cities. This was a real imperial victory. But the war was not over, because the Greeks still had one great weapon left: their fleet. The decisive turning point came at Salamis. The Greek fleet, led in large part by Themistocles, drew the Persians into the narrow waters near the island of Salamis. There, the larger Persian naval force could not fully use its numbers and mobility. In the confined space, the Greeks struck hard. The result was a major Persian naval defeat. And this changed everything. Why? Because an empire invading across great distances depends on supply, coordination, and strategic flexibility. Without naval control, the Persian position became far more difficult. Xerxes could not risk everything in a prolonged campaign under unstable conditions. So he withdrew with much of the army, leaving forces behind in Greece. This was the moment when Persian expansion into mainland Greece began to break. In 479 BC, the conflict reached its final decisive phase. At the Battle of Plataea, Greek forces defeated the remaining Persian army in mainland Greece. Around the same time, the Greeks also won at Mycale, striking Persian forces in Asia Minor. Together, these defeats ended Persia's attempt to conquer mainland Greece. And yet, this is where perspective matters most. Because even after these defeats, the Persian Empire did not collapse. It remained enormous. It remained wealthy. It remained powerful. It continued to dominate much of the known world for generations. Greece had survived, but Persia remained an empire. This is one of the greatest misunderstandings in popular history. The Greco-Persian Wars were not the destruction of Persia. They were the limit of Persian westward expansion. That is a very different thing. After the failed invasion, the Persian Empire continued under later kings. It remained a major world power for more than a century. It still ruled Persia, Mesopotamia, Egypt, at times, with interruptions, much of Anatolia, the Levant, large eastern territories stretching towards Central Asia. But something had changed. The image of unstoppable expansion was gone. The empire had found its boundary in the Greek world. In the years that followed, Persia would still influence Greek politics, fund rival city-states, and shape the eastern Mediterranean indirectly. But the dream of full conquest over mainland Greece had faded, and over time, internal court struggles, regional tensions, succession problems, and imperial fatigue began to grow. The empire was still mighty, but it was no longer rising. It was enduring, and eventually, another conqueror would come from the west. A young king from Macedon, Alexander. But that is another story. So what was the Persian Empire, really? Was it the villain of Greek legend? A vast eastern despotism? A failed conqueror at the gates of Europe? No, it was far greater, and far more important, than that. The Achaemenid Persian Empire was one of the greatest civilizations in human history. It built one of the first true world empires. It ruled diverse peoples across continents. It mastered administration, taxation, roads, communication, and imperial governance on a scale the world had rarely seen before. It did not survive because it was merely brutal. It survived because it was organized, because it adapted, because it understood that power is not only about conquering land, but about holding it. From Cyrus the Great to Darius, from Persepolis to Egypt, from Babylon to the edge of Greece, Persia reshaped the ancient world, and even where it failed, it changed history. Because the clash between Persia and Greece would define how later civilizations remembered East and West, empire and freedom, order and resistance. But behind the myths, the truth is simpler. Persia was not just an enemy in someone else's story. It was a civilization of extraordinary intelligence, scale, and ambition, and without Persia, the ancient world would have looked very different. This was the story of the Persian Empire, from the rise of Cyrus the Great, to the brilliance of Darius, to the glory of Persepolis, and finally, to the wars that revealed the limits of even the greatest empire. But Persia did not vanish in defeat. Its legacy endured, in government, culture, kingship, and the memory of empires that came after it, and in many ways, the world still remembers its shadow. This is Relics of Time. If you enjoyed this journey into the ancient world, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter, because history is never truly gone. It only waits to be remembered.